Jacinta Ritchie. I'm a member of the Mississquoi Band of Abenaki and Cree from around Saskatchewan. And I actually run a law firm, J.S. Ritchie, PLLC. I went to Vermont Law School. I had the opportunity to work with my tribe when I was there. And I focused on energy law and regulation. And before getting into that, I did my undergraduate work at the University of Washington, and I focused on the Hanford site in Eastern Washington and looked at disproportionate health impacts to women, children, and the unborn from the Hanford site, and specifically how traditional knowledge could transform risk assessment methodologies. Oh, okay. So, yeah, that's kind of where we're coming from today, I guess. And I'm really grateful to be a part of this project. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming in. I know that, especially as Native people or Indigenous people, we often are not really vocalized or represented properly, like within the law and in business or like assessment or anything, right?
Yeah.
So it's very exciting that you're part of this and able to give back to the community. So I'm kind of curious about you said that you do like the risk assessment and what did that entail?
Yeah, so my undergraduate work, the thesis was all around risk assessment and the environmental justice issues with the Hanford site. So the traditional methodology for risk assessment is all based on reference man, which is like a healthy white man in his 30s, which is the standard Hanford worker. And there's like allowable number of cancers within that population. But the risk assessment method that they have in place doesn't account for the disproportionate impact to women in their reproductive years, children, and Indigenous populations that typically have a lot of different transmission pathways, whether that's like the increased amount of salmon that's part of the diet, even down to when you're weaving a basket and you put a reed in your mouth. That's another transmission pathway that traditional risk assessment methodologies don't take into account. So that was and then we utilized like more qualitative research methodologies, like interviews with people, right? Because that's traditionally how we transmit our knowledge, is through stories. So just focusing on doing interviews with people that were directly impacted. And I looked at every chink in the chain of the nuclear production chain. There's these disproportionate health impacts to people of color, particularly Indigenous people. You know, if we go to the Dene mines where they mine the uranium, and then we go to Hanford where they refine it into plutonium, and then even, where it's stored. And like currently, the Hanford site it's the most contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. And it's right along the Columbia River, which pumps the most fresh water into the Pacific Ocean than any other source on Turtle Island, right? And that contaminant is going through the soil and the groundwater, getting into the last untampered with salmon spawning grounds. And that's just the direct in each, the salmon will ingest that contamination and it just gets more and more concentrated. So by the time that we ingest our traditional foods, it's a really high level of contamination.
It's like an interesting parallel, like the Columbia River is just right there, right? And salmon is a traditional food to people in coastal English territories here.
Right.
And if we think about the Tacoma smelter plume,
right,
I was reading through the reports, and I don't think they really are explicit about if they did a risk assessment, or how they took into account, if at all, those traditional knowledges that you just mentioned.
And different transmission pathways, right? Because we see more people of color, lower income brackets, immigrant communities traditionally have more, kitchen gardens, things like that. And if those soils are going to be contaminated by the smelter, which we do know, when we're ingesting those foods that are sacred to us that we grow in our backyard or whatever, it's going to be an increased contamination source. They have found that in certain communities, I think they did a study in LA where they had really bad lead contamination. And they did find that certain communities had less lead in their blood. And that was due to the increased amount of cilantro in the diet, which gets the heavy metals out of the blood. But it's just, I don't think current risk assessment methodologies look at the different behaviors within those communities and how it can increase the negative health impacts of being exposed to that kind of thing.
Yeah. So something that is important to consider is even the methodologies are taught in school or even practice within businesses or schools or even like within policy and like law.
Yeah.
How have you ever seen risk, like the risk assessments, the health impacts, some of these like traditional research methodologies be used to be able to do us advocacy work through law, or like how if we were to get.
Yeah, I think that addressing the methodology, right, for how we establish, I think, the idea of having this allowable number of cancers is kind of crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But even that is based on a flawed model because it's just looking at how those levels would impact healthy white men in their 30s. So changing the methodology and doing more research on how people are actually impacted, what the actual contamination level is as it stands, and then coming up with remediation practices, which would often involve a lot of Indigenous knowledge, because Indigenous knowledge we can utilize to clean up, the contaminants.
Do you currently know if there's like a mandate or policy, or if people are interested in becoming involved in that sector to bring like a specialist or know their rights?
I think that there's some work being done on like bioremediation. I know that like Paul Stamets is doing some work with like using the mycelium to do some cleanup and different things like that. I know there's interest, but I think currently in policy, it's leaning more towards qualitative, right? Like the numbers. And they're not emphasizing as much the importance of actually talking to people on the ground in the community that are impacted by these things. And there's actually a wealth of knowledge that could be utilized to address the problem if they actually talk to the people on the ground.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about that because the way that the smelter was bought off the land, and we keep track of like the historical references, I think that was during the time period of like the Indian removal, the Morrill Act, like land grabs, right?
Right.
So it kind of shows about like the impacts of capitalism and like revenue and like that business model, So
I think, I know when I was in law school, I had a really hard time with property law. Because it's all based on the doctrine of discovery, right? Like someone from this one place comes, even though there's people there, I discovered it and now it's mine, right? And, I know in my culture, we don't own the land, we're responsible for it, and it passes matrilineally. And we have an interest culturally in just, how we operate to take care of the land instead of having this ownership model where you conquer it, you exploit it, and then you flip it, and typically what it gets flipped to is lower income populations, right? And then those are the people that have to live with the environmental consequences of how that land has been exploited. So I think the whole model kind of doesn't have the built-in incentives to take care of the land like our traditional practices did.
Yeah.
And do,
Yeah. Yeah, something I'm kind of thinking about is like you do property law and like thinking about like the business model. I know that sometimes now tribes or organizations are buying land back.
Yeah.
Right. So how would you say sometimes there can be that contention of you guys are just going to buy it back and they think that we're going to do the same thing, right? So like
I guess it would be from sovereign nation to sovereign nation is going to do it differently, right? Because I know it's very difficult sometimes when you have an industry capture, right? And all the jobs are the Hanford site, or all the jobs are these mining operations. It can be difficult. So I think if you have a fundamental principle within your governance structure where you look out for those sort of things, it's better. And, the biodiversity on the planet is typically protected by Indigenous people, even to this day, right? And with, emphasizing traditional food and medicine and those sort of practices, typically we see a higher degree of like land stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there are, tribes that are in the oil and gas industry, for example, right? And that's a huge part of the economy. And sometimes it's hard to get away from that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, for example, like North Dakota, you have certain tribes that allow fracking, but I know Turtle Mountain Chippewa, they were one of the first people by tribal resolution to ban fracking on tribal lands. So you can see some work being done in that area, and it's kind of a sovereign nation by sovereign nation thing, and it's not universal across tribes.
And it sounds like they're doing that out of necessity because of the current structure, not because it's like the innate value within the community. So I'm curious, like, what are some first steps to consider, say, as a member who's not really well versed in law or like policies, to begin doing like advocacy or activism or something in the way that it correlates with like the land back movement and stewardship of the land?
Yeah, I think that, public participation is really important, and like having access to information like you're sharing. Like I had no idea about the Tacoma smelter situation until you brought it to my attention. So having people working on the ground and raising awareness around these issues is really important. And I think there are a lot of, Indigenous groups that focus on this kind of work. And so figuring out, and then also, sometimes like my friend Cedar Wilkie Gillette, she worked with members of her tribe in Turtle Mountain Chippewa to get this tribal resolution together because they were seeing the drastic impacts from the fracking industry, not only from the environmental damage, but also from these man camps. All these people from outside the reservation are coming in, and we're seeing an increase in missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, men as well, and just an increase of domestic and sexual violence coming out of these man camps that are directly, those are the camps where all the workers come to work on the fracking operations. So I think there's a lot, in addition to the environmental consequences of those, there's also a lot of like societal and cultural consequences that we don't necessarily look at all the time. Mm-hmm. So, but to answer your question, I think most change, right, has happened from these grassroots organizations, and also holding people accountable for like the laws that we have. We have federal regulations that require consultation of tribes and allow for these public participation. They are required to have these public participation meetings where you can go and, voice your concerns, and they have to respond to it in their environmental impact statements. So there are methodologies, but unfortunately, the enforcement isn't great, so a lot of time people will get frustrated, right? It's a lot of emotional labor to do that work. And so if you go and you're constantly telling people what the problem is, and then it isn't adequately addressed, it's just kind of checking off a box instead of having a meaningful check on the situation that implements change. So I think that can be really frustrating. For people, particularly when it's not very well documented. Like I would be interested to see what the environmental impacts of the smelter say and what the actual contamination is for surrounding communities. Because I bet a lot of people living on that land don't know what the what the lead contamination is, for example, in their yard where their kids are playing or they have their garden. So I think we need more information, and I think the people that are causing the contamination should bear the burden of that. And right now, I don't think there's a lot of mechanisms to enforce it.
No, that's true. And say that there is no environmental impact like report,
right?
How would you say is one way that Native people and like individuals who are not Native who might feel like a kinship tie or for some reason want to partake in this, what are some ways that community can get involved to push for that or get that
Um,
moving?
I mean, it would be interesting to see if there are any local ordinances that are governing this. I didn't look deep enough into it. I'd like to learn more about it. But typically, there are, they won't be very well published, right? It'll be like, oh, we have this public participation period, and they'll have like 3 locations where you can go and make your public comment. So that is one way, or, sending letters to your representatives like, hey, we want you to take a look at this. That's one way people can start getting, get started with it. But I think more information around it would be helpful, just even collecting stories of people that are impacted by it, and then having, somebody come in and do testing on the soil would be helpful as well. But for individuals, I mean, you're doing great work just by spreading the information, because I don't think a lot of people, this is even part of the consciousness of what's going on, and people aren't in a very good position to have a feeling one way or the other if they don't know it's happening.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And something I was thinking about is how law policy goes hand in hand with business. And then even like within how we think in Indigenous communities about currency or buying, what it means to like buy from Indigenous or Native owned businesses. Because sometimes people are like, well, you're placing a physical business on land. Isn't that going to damage the land as well? Like, kind of thinking like, what are some ways, or what is it different in the Native business model, or like that mindset when you're supporting Native businesses?
yeah, I mean, with any business, right, you want to look into their business practice, because one of the easiest ways we can, have some sort of control in that area is where we put our dollar. And so, organizations that are committed to environmental sustainable practices is a big one. And really taking, because a lot of people will put that stamp on their business, right? Like, I'm environmentally friendly, but you have to really look at what the practices are, and also like what ingredients they're putting into it. A good example, organization or a business that I really support is Native Botanicals. They're a Lakota family owned company. And I believe it's a wife and her husband, and they have these twin boys, and they go out and they harvest, all the traditional medicines. And then they also, make all the products themselves. So they are harvesting it correctly, right? Respect. And then they also, a portion of their profits go to making sure that those medicines are not over harvested. So you can just look at individual business practices and, how you want to support that. I work with a fair amount of Indigenous owned businesses, and I would say a majority of them are, environmentally minded. But that doesn't, there is the reality of business, right? Like, where maybe some of the products are coming from China or, whatever. So we got to look at that as well, and what the consequences of those business models are. And also, what is going to make their business sustainable. So I think sometimes, those decisions have to be made to make a unit affordable for people. But, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So I was thinking about like how, if you look at the origin of the Tacoma smelter plume, it very much so was like buy the land, then make the copper, demolish, and now there's like millions of dollars worth condos on top of it, right?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, that revenue is not given back to the PLLC nation where they currently reside.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, that's a hard one. And we see that with energy development on tribal nations as well, where a lot of the value will actually go outside of the tribe. So making sure that there are, certain requirements to have, tribal members work there, or a certain amount of that money needs to go to reinvest in the community and make sure that all the benefits of these operations don't just go out of the community and then the community is left with all the environmental consequences of the development that happened there. But that's kind of the model that we have right now, where a lot of the benefits of these developments are going out of the community.
Have you seen any models across Turtle Island or like internationally where they've tried to, I think, do right? Like by non-native people might recognize it.
I'm sure that there is. I'm trying to think of like a really good model right now. I know that, when certain tribes are doing development, they'll make sure that tribal members are employed and that, certain amount of the benefits do stay on the reservation.
Yeah, because even like with these conversations, I think about the reservation and giving back to the reservation, but then people forget that there's natives who live in an urban setting.
Right.
And they themselves are feeling the impacts as well.
Yeah, I don't think the current model really accounts for that, in a meaningful way. So, yeah. But I may be misinformed, but based on my experience, I haven't seen anything, speak to that in a meaningful way.
Something else, you talked about like the health impacts, and there is conversation of like reproductive justice, and then also like the correlation with high infant mortality and MMIP. So I'm kind of curious, like how there's a correlation between reproductive justice and violation of the land.
Yeah, so with the work with the Hanford site, one of the most atrocious things about it were the birth defects that were found. And, a lot of these women in their reproductive years are disproportionately impacted by the same amount of contamination. So it'll go in and then it goes straight to the baby. And what they were finding is that a lot of infertility and a lot of really extreme birth defects, like crazy birth defects that would just make you cry hearing about it. And, the women that it was happening to, they didn't know what was going on. They felt like something was wrong with them, but really it was just because they were exposed to these contaminants that are horrible. So when you damage the land, you're going to damage, the women in your next generations as well. But women that are in their reproductive years typically do have these disproportionate health impacts, and more extreme, you'll see a manifestation in birth defects as well, or the inability to have children.
What would you say is good, like some of the movements or some of the ways that people can become involved or become more aware when it comes to that?
Yeah, I think, it would be great to be armed with knowledge about what we're being exposed to. So then we can take preventative measures to address it, whether that be, eating more cilantro to get these heavy metals out of your bloodstream, or moving, because, but a lot of people may not have the ability to move out of those areas, but I think a good place to start would be to know what we're working with and what better regulations in our food systems, because a lot of the contaminants come from all over the place, but they get concentrated in the food that we eat or the water. So just having knowledge about what's actually in our water, what's in our food, what's in our yard, would be helpful, I think, for people. And then it would also, probably demystify some people's, perplexity about why they're having problems with their reproduction, why they're having these hormonal imbalances, and, possibly why they're having to deal with some birth defects as a result of that exposure during pregnancy.
Yeah. And you touched on something like on where we live and like having a choice.
Right.
Right. And a lot of, especially in our communities, whether it's even off the reservation, have to live in like Section 8 housing or like the most deplorable conditions. I know that we have Seller 17, which has to disclose, the landlord has to disclose to the tenant or the renter or the homeowner that there might be contaminant.
Right.
Do you know, like, if there's any resources or any way that communities can use that to their benefit to kind of push?
Yeah, I think, again, that would come down to enforcement, right? Because you can get that slip of paper that's like, hey, you may have lead contamination at this place. There may be lead paint here, or, there may be some contaminant source. But oftentimes, either that information isn't provided, or it's that situation where it's like, oh, like this is the one place I can afford. I need to, move into this place. So I know that there are, for instance, you can have the city come in and test for black mold. That's another contaminant that, really impacts people in a meaningful way. And you can have people come in and do those assessments. But oftentimes, it's a lot of jumping through hoops, right? That maybe not everyone has the time to do that. And I would imagine the backlog is pretty bad because I know that we have a pretty bad mold problem. So I'd be interested to see if there are any mechanisms that community members could use to get a third-party testing for the lead levels in their yard from the smelter.
Yeah.
I would hope so.
There's different labs.
Yeah.
Individuals have to pay between, the lowest is like $30. Some people don't even have $20 to eat for the week.
Well, and that seems like something that should be the burden of the people causing the contamination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you guys are the ones profiting off of it, so there should be some sort of requirement for them to pay for that sort of thing, because it shouldn't be the burden of people that are just trying to live there.
Mm-hmm.
That are going to be impacted by it the most.
That's true.
Yeah. But I mean, I think it's wonderful if people are, are going to take the incentive to do that, or, really want to know, but it can be really financially burdensome. Like I think if you get like a water testing kit off Amazon, it's like $100 and something just to see if you have arsenic in your water. And a lot of people do have arsenic in their water supply. And, who knows what else, right? Because I would imagine that those kits don't have the lab technology that you would need to really figure out what's all in that water or in your soil in your yard. So it would take a higher level and a pretty considerable investment in a concerted effort to get that data and figure out where the contamination actually is. So, yeah. I feel like I have all bad news.
Yeah, I mean,
it's really important to talk about, and a lot of people pay this stuff lip service, and we'd like to think that we're in a super clean place. But I don't think we really do know the gravity of the environmental contaminants that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. That may be, in the water that we drink or shower, or like bathe our kids in. We don't have that information.
Something I heard recently is that now Native people are using law to personify the land in a way to then kind of like add protections. So I was kind of curious, like if you've heard about that and like as it pertains to property law.
I'd love to learn more about that. I met this man. He was an activist out of the Philippines, and he actually created this new model where he had future generations having standing in a court case. So he could bring a lawsuit for future generations because they would have standing, right, to bring a suit. And I think some of that work is being done by the young people in our communities where they're getting more active and they have more of an interest in their future in the next, 7 generations. So I think that sort of creative advocacy is actually really exciting, and could, bear some fruit, if they had enough support.
Like for our youth, right?
Yeah.
Because they seem to be interested in understanding that they're the future ancestors.
Yeah.
Right?
And they're taking their responsibilities really seriously, which is great to see. Because I think, I think a lot of people, I'll speak for myself, like doing environmental justice work, you can get fatigued after a while. It's, and it does take all of us to come together and have a concerted effort to make some change.
Yeah.
And putting pressure on lawmakers to create new regulations that actually have some teeth, and there's some consequences for, not following the environmental regulations. But unfortunately, a lot of times, companies will get fined, and it's this nominal amount that hasn't, it doesn't hurt their bottom line at all. So there's no incentive to actually change the practice or meaningfully address, the consequences of their development, because it would just be cheaper for them to pay the fine. So I think pushing for more aggressive environmental regulations that actually have meaningful consequences would be great. Or, also just investing in energy efficiency and renewable energy development. Because the reality is we can't get these big contamination sources offline unless we have something to transfer to. Or, developing materials that are less toxic. Like plastic is terrible, right? Like the microplastics are drastically increasing infertility. And it's in everything. So coming up with an alternative and, making it more cost effective to use these safer alternatives would be needed to actually make the transition from an economic standpoint. I think there's a regulatory aspect of things, and there's also the economics of it. Because I think a lot of these industries that are causing us a lot of the biggest problems, they have all of these financial incentives to continue doing it. They get, a lot of money from the government for doing things the way they do it. And these companies don't have any incentive to do it differently because they've already invested so much money in the processes they have. So they're going to do it for as long as they can because they're going to keep making money off of it. And there's no incentive to do it differently. And the organizations and companies and people that want to do it differently don't have the financial resources to compete with these mega corporations that are so entrenched and control everything. These mega corporations pretty much own everything. And they're the ones that are contaminating everything. And that's where a lot of our dollar goes. Like I was watching something and it's like, you think that these companies are these clean companies, right? And then you actually look at who owns a majority of their stock, and they're these mega corporations. So it's more of a marketing ploy than a meaningful move in the right direction. But I think that people do have a lot of power. Like I was seeing that, the average retirement, like if we pulled together all the retirement savings that people have, you'd have enough money to buy the whole S&P 500. Like, but we don't, I'll speak for myself. Like, I don't think about those things on a day-to-day basis because I'm so busy trying to survive, right? And it's hard to know where to put your dollar, I guess. Yeah. But I do think there are communities doing really good work, that are definitely, buying locally and doing all that. But I think to do it on the scale that we need to actually address the problem is going to take some large scale work. And I mean, if we think about how much money we pay in taxes,
Mm-hmm.
it's not that the money isn't there, it's that it's being filtered to other sources. Mostly the military industrial complex, which is one of the biggest environmental disasters there is.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think if we had more control of where our tax dollar went, we could actually have the resources to meaningfully engage with these issues and fix them. It's just not where our money is going right now. The more we engage with our community, the more we engage with our culture and our language and go back to who we are and implement those practices within our life, I think that does have a ripple effect. And a lot of our traditional foods and medicines can protect us from a lot of these contaminants.
Yeah, that's true.
But if you don't have access to the land, or you do have access, but it's contaminated with radioactive waste that has a 50,000 year half-life, it's something that needs a large scale intervention. And I don't think we're currently putting a lot of resources into that.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
And tying everything together as well. It's very important, right? Because we talk about our traditional knowledge systems, our foods, and the health impacts, and also something that's left out is following the dollar and how it's been commercialized, land labeled in a way, but yet able to go back to our own ways and practices is kind of challenging when we're faced all this. There's no nice boat to wrap it all up.
Yeah, and it is difficult, but yeah, going back to where that dollar goes, right, is important. And then I think there is hope, but I think that we need to kind of come together and get a baseline of what we're dealing with, have all the facts of where we stand right now before we can actually come together and figure out a way to address it. And I think that, our current society keeps us so distracted all the time, and things just go, business as usual. And I do think that it should be the burden of these people that are creating all the contamination to provide that information. And then we can all work together to figure out how to address it in a meaningful way. And I think it would be great for them to talk to some more people on the ground, and do that testing of, what the soil contamination looks like. And then also do blood testing on individuals that maybe, have a garden in their yard and are eating, or are drinking predominantly from a contaminated water source. So then we can figure out what to do with, to have a health intervention as well. Because the longer it goes on, the more it builds up in your system, and the more treacherous the manifestations are for people's health.
No, yeah, thank you so much for coming in and sharing, especially because when we talk about law, policy, activism, reproductive rights, land rights, corporations, sometimes they can get very complex and frightening and unhopeful, but then we do see our youth can see it and then be well, what's the point of me being active? But then you're but you guys are doing it, and these are some of the future paths since we're getting older and getting tired.
I know, right? Well, and I think that the environmental law and policy is confusing by design. And I think they sneak in a fair amount of other stuff into it that doesn't actually address the problem. So, actually, and it's a lot of work to actually go through an environmental regulation or a new policy. It's thousands of pages. And when you actually go through it and see all the stuff, all the provisions that are snuck in there, it's interesting. So it does, I think it is hopeful. And I think that the solution is more simple than we'd like to think, but it would involve us kind of coming together to insist on some accountability from our representation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So you can find me, JS Ritchie PLLC is my law firm. I'm on Instagram at Jacinta, JACINTA _639. And my business line is 206-775-6331. There's also a lot of really amazing Indigenous organizations doing this sort of work. So I would just do some research independently and reach out to them as well.